My name is Amanda Brødsgaard. It's a very international name. And I am a PhD fellow at the University of Copenhagen in Denmark. So I'm entering my last final year of the PhD. This is very much a work in progress, so bear with me. It might be a bit fragmented, but yeah, we'll see how it works out. You can always ask questions later. Yes, so my PhD project is titled Techno-nationalism and the Land of the Rising Robots. And it focuses specifically on this co-creational aspect of how policy and technoscience sort of interrelate. I'm focusing on robotics, specifically humanoid robots or social robots, not as much the industrial part, just FYI. And I'm currently trying to write. I think you guys probably remember how it was being a PhD student. Final year is hard. Yeah. Oh, wait, this is the one. So just a quick overview of my presentation. I'll introduce why I was interested in Japanese robotics in general, focus a bit on the project, and try to sort of convince you that this is a really good idea. And focus a bit as well on the theoretical frameworks I'm working with, which will come near the end. I might delve into a bit of the paradigms in Japanese robotics, probably, because I think it's quite important. So it's very much focused on robots this time, and not as much on policy. So I hope that's okay. Yeah. Oh, right, yeah. So when it comes to robots, there are these notions of Japanese people really, really loving robots. And I was always really interested in the ways that this is framed in the media, especially in the West. Also, sometimes in Japan, I've spoken to some researchers, Japanese researchers, who do research on robotics, and they tend to agree. So we have these very different types of headlines where there's this very, oh no, what's going to happen when the robots take over? How Westerners are very fearful of robots and Japanese people love robots. How, the humanoid robot will become soon part of the family in Japan and everything. So in the West, it's very much based on fear, whereas in Japan, it's based on this, love of the robot. I don't think I necessarily agree with this, but yeah, we can always discuss that later. But I have seen a lot of people refer to this supposed love of robots in Japan. This is also why I focus on robots, because it is sort of like an extension of or an amalgamation of these different narratives of cool Japan, but also of wacky Japan when it comes to the Western view of Japan and robots. I don't know if you know the whole paradigm of wacky Japan, is sort of wacky Orientalism, whereas, things are so crazy in Japan. I totally understand why they love robots. And there is this tendency, I think, in relationships to Japanese robotics to talk about this, either the very traditional society of Japan or the very technological future of Japan. There's this like the past merging with the future, but never really in the present. And it does make sense to me somewhat that there is this idea that Japan should love robots because of the demographic crises. These are seen as these technological solutions, also as a way to sort of boost the economy in a sense and not really necessarily want to have immigrants or something. So these are robotic solutions to some of these problems that Japans are having. I'm using STS, Science and Technology Studies, because it is, to simplify it a lot, based on this interaction between science, technology, and society. And I view the robot especially as a vantage point to examine these societies because it sort of, as a boundary object, almost straddles this, futuristic fiction in a sense, but also has some roots in reality because the technology is somewhat there. We can again discuss that. And now, I think with the very rapid way that technology is sort of developing in the world in general, there are a lot of global trends towards robotics and AI and stuff like that. And we also see in Japan these policy initiatives. A lot of them have been mentioned already, the Society 5.0, Innovation 25, Moonshot program. And then there is the technological development that is happening, but I would argue that a lot of these robots that are discussed in these policy initiatives are imaginary, like they don't exist yet. The things that they're supposed to be able to do are not there yet. Also, we're seeing globally, but also in Japan, a worsening of different types of crises. And I'm focusing especially on the demographic crises which we see in Japan, but also in China and in South Korea and in Europe, where I think the idea that is that these robots that we're about to create, we're on the cusp of creation, will mitigate these crises and sort of fix everything. Yes, so my main focus is on trying to examine the role of the Japanese government, robotics industry, and public communication praxes in this co-construction of science and technology in Japan, and also Japanese techno-nationalism through the theoretical lens of STS, which sounds like a lot. I can see that. It will work out at some point, I think. And I have these more specific research questions. These are not all of them, but some of them. So how does this advanced technology shed light on the workings of innovation policy in Japan, as well as on the human and non-human actors involved in Japanese innovation policy? And how does innovation policy and advanced technology in Japan co-create one another? In what ways are they engaged in co-creation with society and human actors? And how is it sort of perceived and enacted through a variety of actors? I will just do some quick concept clarifications here. Again, advanced technology in this sense, I usually focus on robots, social robots, humanoid robots. I focus specifically on Japan because I'm employed in a Japan Studies position, but you could look at this in a variety of other countries as well. This is meant more of a case study and not necessarily because I think that there is this overwhelming presence of robots, especially social robots in Japan. Also, when I talk about the whole STS thing, I do primarily focus on socio-technical imaginaries, that framework, but also the framework of something called praxeography, which is sort of a post-actor network theory thing. And I will get into why these frameworks do make sense together, but also how they have some trickiness to them. Yeah, because they differ quite a bit ontologically. I'm focusing materially on the science and technology policy in Japan, which is now more of a science, technology, and innovation policy. So it is quite based on policy and the way that socio-technical imaginaries are created through these policies, but also how they impact them. Like this, again, the whole co-production, co-creation thing. Yeah, so it's also very much based on publicly available materials because I do think that the whole communication to the public from the nation state is very important in sort of maintaining and creating these socio-technical imaginaries and the techno-nationalism that sort of goes hand in hand with it, in my opinion anyway. Yeah, also a bunch of other things. So just to be a bit clear on what I mean when I talk about robots, and especially in this specific context. As Hirotaka Osawa mentioned, the concept of the robot, the word robot, stems from this Czech play that was written in 1920 and was put on display, I guess, in 21, called Russian Universal Robots, where there are these artificial humans who sort of rebel against their human masters in this sort of very class struggle thing. It came to Japan, this play as well, and it was translated into Jinso Ningen, and it was sort of met with this both a lot of glee. I think people thought it was really, really cool, but also with a lot of doomsday things, and especially in the context that we're seeing this play in, was right after the Meiji period, where the whole westernization and technologization of Japan was happening. It sort of created this weird robotic boom. Yeah, and this whole word is, in its essence, it means sort of forced labor or servitude or slave labor. There's a lot of different roots to it. It's Slav, but in the Czech Republic, I think it means forced labor. The thing is, though, this is not the first time we've seen robots in the global imagination. We have had robots or artificial humanoids exist in a variety of cultures from millennia ago. We have from the ancient Chinese text, I don't know how to pronounce it, Liezi, I think. There's also a brief mention of it in the Iliad. And automated technology has existed for a really, really long time, also before in Japan. Because there is this usual tendency to talk about the first prevalence of the robot in Japan or in the world as the karakuri ningyo from the Edo period, the wooden automated dolls. it has existed in our imagination for a really, really long time, globally. And in Japan, then this whole robot boom sort of gave rise to a robotic prototype, like a humanoid figure that was put on display by Nishimura Makoto in 1928, called Gaktensoku, which also became quite a success, and has sort of helped create this more positive image of the Japanese robot. And my prime example is always Astro Boy, because that's what robotic engineers in Japan usually refer to as being like the prototype, like, you know, the young, helpful robot that just saves the world and everything. Yeah. So all of these iterations of the robot, there is a tendency in academia, if you look down below right there, that there are two paradigms when it comes to Japanese robotics. There's this one sense of accepting that Japan has a unique love of robot that's only Japanese, and it's uniquely Japanese, and it's very based in Japanese culture. There's this one part of academia that agrees upon that, and then there's the other part that sort of disagrees on the fact that this cultural affinity should exist, but they do accept that there is a push towards robots in Japan as a result of other factors. And I think these factors are based in techno-nationalism from the Japanese point of view, and from the Western point of view, it's more of a techno-orientalism. It's not necessarily the techno-orientalism of the 80s, where you saw Japanese people being sort of prototyped as robots, they only work and they're cold and stuff like that. It's more of a, look at this wacky nation, they just love robots based on all of these different cultural factors. So in the paradigms, the three major things of robotic myth-making in Japan is positive media representation, wherein you see, you know, compared to the West, where we have stuff like Blade Runner or Terminator with the evil robots, Japanese people have positive media representations of robots as helpful to society. Then there's the Shinto animism. This can also sometimes be replaced by Buddhism, or a sort of philosophical term from Japanese philosophy, wherein there's this idea that because of the animistic tendencies of Shinto, where everything has a soul, like Nicole mentioned earlier, well, yesterday actually, that also the robot would have a soul, and that's why Japanese people would accept it. And then there is the concept of invented traditions, which I've come to realize is apparently a widely known concept. But when it comes to Japanese robotics, it refers to the karakuri ningyo. They did exist, but they were largely forgotten until the 1960s, where it was sort of brought back as an example of why technological prowess has always been a part of the Japanese DNA, basically. Yeah. So these two paradigms exist. And this is part of this robotic myth-making. Yeah. And then I also think there's a bunch of other things happening here, that this techno-nationalism, where, you know, you sort of had this entwinement of the Japanese robot and Japanese culture, originates quite early on. And it has to do with this like post-war national identity, connecting modernity, technology, and everything, but also somewhat of the like a reaction to the Western gaze, in a sense. I also do think that while there is a lot of social issues happening and a lot of economic things, there's also this, you know, very specific way of connecting what is seen as this idealized, romanticized notion of the past into the future. This sense of the glorious past will bring us to a glorious future. Oh, wait, where am I now? Yeah, oh well, we'll see. These are some of the different paradigms that I'm talking about, but I think I will skip this for now. You're more than welcome to talk to me about it when it comes to, in general, what's happening with STS and works on robotics. Yes. So the framework I'm using, socio-technical imaginaries, I assume that a lot of you have some understanding of it, in a sense. It is based on this idiom of co-production that Sheila Jasanoff sort of invented, I guess, coined, where there's this understanding of the fact, or of the ways in which technological artifacts sort of implicate our society in different ways, trying to move away from the dichotomy of social determinism and technological determinism, which was on the previous slide that I didn't explain. Yeah. And I think this is very vital when it comes to, thank you, the whole understanding of the innovation policy, because innovation policy is in its sense, in my opinion at least, a vision of the good future, right? It has this, we make this policy, we try to figure out what we would invest in, what we think is important to create a version of the future that we're happy with. And when it comes to social technical imaginaries, these visions of the good states, they sort of justifies investment into research and development in different sectors, which then again reaffirms the state and it's the state's power. It's very much based on cultural understandings of the ideal future. And yeah, science, technology, and innovation policy in Japan is very much rooted in this. I also think, which I haven't actually written too much about yet, is that a lot of this innovation policy is also just reiterations of former industrial policy of the 60s as well. I think there's a lot of relation, again, to the past and how the past sort of implicate or influences the way in which we also view the future, which we've also touched a bit upon today. Yeah, there are these specific ideas for the future, all based in this socio-technical imaginary, and I'm looking into the ways in which the robot sort of plays a role in the formation of the socio-technical imaginaries, but also, again, how these then impact the ways in which we look at the robots and the ways in which it's developed. So I'm trying to sort of merge this with something called praxeography. It's based on Anne-Marie Moll's seminal work, The Body Multiple, which is very post-actor network theory. And it talks a lot about the multiplicity of things, right? It's part of the ontological turn in the field. And it, in essence, it's this whole idea that there's this illness that she studies and how this illness is multiple things to different people, right? It's one thing to the patient, it's one thing to the doctor, it's one thing to the anesthesiologist and everything. It's multiple in a sense. And the ways in which it is enacted is different in different places. I think that looking at the robot from this vantage point could provide a more nuanced description of it, because I don't think that the developers of the robots see the same version of the robots that policymakers do or that the users do. And I think I'm trying to sort of visualize it like this, sort of like a Venn diagram that fleshes out the robot, the more layers that we have in these like infinite iterations of what the robot is, the robotic figure, basically. So I don't necessarily focus on one robot, but the idea, the imaginations of the robot. So what is this robot to policymakers, to caregivers at elder care facilities, to engineers, to the shoppers in the supermarkets? I don't think we necessarily need to answer whether or not the robot is loved in Japan, but more look into how these narratives are sort of circulated in society and what they have of an implication towards the different people who engage with the robot. So finally, these frameworks don't really work that well together because they really, really differ on an ontological level. So when it comes to praxeography, non-human actors are seen as ontologically equal to human, whereas in socio-technical imaginaries, humans are seen as having way more agency than non-human actors. So I'm trying to sort of figure this thing out. I do think that they can be related. I see socio-technical imaginaries as looking at this from sort of a macro level, whereas praxeography zooms in on specific parts of the robots in the socio-technical imaginary. And I think they sort of create this cyclical framework. So the robotic figure is one enactment. The praxeographical account of the robot shows the socio-technical imaginary surrounding this technology and what types of imaginations are like give prominence to certain versions of the robots and hides others. So very much like a whole idea of which narrative is more powerful in a sense. Yeah, I hope I covered everything.